Welcome to the California Poor People's Campaign new member welcome session. And we are going to be starting shortly. And the first thing that we want to do as people are joining is that we want to share a song with you. You know, art, culture, and theomusicology is an integral part of the strategy that we use for challenging the interlocking injustices. And so we're going to share this song, which is Everybody's Got a Right to Live. It's a traditional song. It was written actually during the 1968 Poor People's Campaign by Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick and Jimmy Collier. And this version is features songs in the key of resistance by New York City, PPC Sound Engineering, vocals Sharon Rebar, Ciara Taylor, Pauline Pisano, and spoken word by Lou Aya. Enjoy.
Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody's got a right to live.
I feel this melody in the footsteps of the people, rising up in the rhythm of dignity and courage. When I see you, I suddenly believe liberation can flourish, and generosity and humility will save us. And we will use the love our mamas gave us to decolonize the skies above us with praises. Learning from the bravest, the beautiful, nameless creators of a world newly awakened. We on fire and blazing our way out the matrix, guided by a single mother's hand, holding her family together. We already on the other side of never. We're the aunties brewing tea and sipping sweetness from the south to the north. We are here to remind those in D.C. who they working for. That's right, beloved. This song is Freedom Uncovered.
Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody's got a right to live.
What Harriet walked towards, what the people in Selma marched for, what the riots from Stonewall to Ferguson to Minneapolis fought for. A movement of people who pour in dollars but rich in brilliance. We are the millions, the healers who come to heal, the leaders who come to reveal that the right to live means you've had the right to feel what you feel. The right to live means an end to police violence and the passage of a Green New Deal. The right to live is in the wind, and every day we witness in our children's countless talents. The right to live is harmonizing in the voice of Yara Allen. It is the springtime and you can feel the right to live about to bloom, growing out the organizing of comrades like Sierra and Sharon and Claudia de la Cruz. Esto es el momento de pararnos como madres orgullosas y sonreír, porque no hay nada más esencial que el derecho de vivir. The right to live is a simple truth to return us to ourselves. It is a spell being cast upon a lost and divided nation to heal the wounds of hate and incarceration with a love so bold it includes everybody. Feel that, everybody. And when you fight for those rights, they become the lights for us to follow through these long dark nights. This is a promise to be radically honest and declare we are worthy of food to eat and housing to sleep in and schools to dream in and just being human beings. We are worthy of love. And so the Poor People's Campaign has come to bring our freedom into being. You will know we've arrived because you will hear us sing.
Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live.
So again, I want to welcome everybody to the California Poor People's Campaign new member welcome session, and say we're glad you're here. And just want to remind everybody that we are recording this session. And so if you don't want to be on camera, please turn your camera off. And if you haven't already introduced yourself in the chat, please do that. So a little later in the session, we're gonna have some breakouts so that people get a chance to meet each other and reflect on the presentation that we're gonna offer. So I wanna ask you to take a moment to change your name. We wanna have people do breakouts by the region. And so if you would change your name, if you put your cursor in the corner, upper right corner of your screen, there are 3 little dots. And if you click on that, you'll have a few options for things to do, including to rename yourself. And so what we want to ask you to do is to rename yourself and to name yourself starting with the initials representing the region that you live in. And so if you're from the Bay Area, that's BA. If you're from the Inland Empire, that's IE. If you are from Los Angeles, that's LA. San Diego, SD. Orange County, OC. Sacramento, ST. And if you're not in any of those regions, you're in what we call the at-large region. And so that would be AL. Okay. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Mason, who is one of the people who's been working on from the speakers training working group that developed this welcome session. And I want to acknowledge our tech support, Reverend Rowan Fairgrove, who actually was the creator of the original slideshow that we've been using as our template. So thank you so much, Reverend Rowan, for that. And Mary Claire Newman, who is also a member of the Speaker Training Working Group. Thank you both, and they're our tech support for this session. Okay, Mason, I think I covered everything, but if I didn't, feel free to add it in.
Yeah, thank you, Nell. Well, hi, everybody. It's great to be here with you. My name is Mason Ewald. I'm here in the Bay Area as well, just south of the city in the peninsula on Ramaytush Ohlone land, and my pronouns are he and him. I will just a heads up, I will be starting a presentation that Nell and I will go through together before we go into breakouts, and then I need to actually leave for an appointment. So I may not be here on the other side of those breakout groups, but I'll leave my contact info if anyone feels, called to reach out. You're welcome to contact me. So I'm going to share my screen here, and it may take me just a second to do that effectively, but then I will begin the presentation. Okay, so somebody interrupt me if you cannot see the slides correctly, but it looks like it's displaying okay. So yeah, first of all, welcome to the California Poor People's Campaign, and to the Poor People's Campaign in general, a national call for moral revival. We're happy you're here, and maybe some of you have been to this welcome session before and are wanting to just refamiliarize yourself with our background and some of the next steps, but for everyone that's here for the first time, we're really happy you're here. We're going to explore a number of rich topics, but primarily as an introduction today we'll provide some background on the history of the Poor People's Campaign, and then how the current present day campaign began, some of its structure and philosophy, and some of the more recent activations and events that we've been participating in. So we hope you'll want to step forward and join us in a number of next steps. And there'll be plenty of information at the end of the presentation in terms of how to do that. So beginning with some of the history of the Poor People's Campaign. In 1967 and 1968, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, various civil rights leaders, and others came together to forge a campaign to bring national attention to the unjust economic conditions facing millions of people all over the world. Dr. King emphasized the need for poor whites, Blacks, Latinos, Asians, and Native Americans to unite into what he called a new and unsettling force and a fusion movement. He asserted that the Poor People's Campaign would only be successful if the poor would come together across all of the various obstacles and barriers that have been set up over time to divide them, and if they could demand the attention of resources being diverted because of the US engagement in the then Vietnam War. One of the quotes I'll read from Dr. King is, quote, "We are coming to Washington in a Poor People's Campaign. Yes, we are going to bring the tired, the poor, the huddled masses. We are coming to demand that the government address itself to the problem of poverty." So we'll start by taking a moment to focus on the tenets of the Poor People's Campaign. One of them in particular, respect poor people. Dr. King and the others who were involved in the campaign in the early days were not only proposing new government policies, they were calling for radical transformation across society, resting on a few key insights that are displayed here. One, poverty is not just another issue among a range of social problems, it's systemic. Rather than compartmentalizing the issues that create and exacerbate conditions of poverty, the campaign takes a holistic view, as you'll see, of interlocking injustices, and as part of a fusion movement, which we'll talk more about later. Number two, poor people are not a special interest group. Again, those who are poor and low income cannot be compartmentalized or relegated to a constituency and pitted against each other, against other groups with competing interests. Number three, poor people can come together to transform the whole of society. The commitment to bringing people together forms the core of this work and the principles of the campaign, as you'll see. And number four, to lift the load of poverty, a critical mass of people needs to change their thinking and their behavior. Drawing a critical mass of people into the campaign has been a guiding principle since its earliest beginnings and through present time. Part of that critical mass and the size of the network we've been able to develop is also part of what drew me into the campaign as well. The Poor People's Campaign began in Washington, where key leaders of the campaign gathered for lobbying efforts and media events before dispersing around the country to formally launch the 9 regional caravans, bringing thousands of participants to Washington. Those 9 caravans were the Eastern Caravan, the Appalachia Trail, the Southern Caravan, the Midwest Caravan, the Indian Trail, the San Francisco Caravan, the Western Caravan, and the Mule Train and the Freedom Train. These caravans were part of the campaign's plans for gaining significant public attention and support for its demands over 3 main strategies. One was constructing a shanty town called Resurrection City on the National Mall between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, which was housed to 1,500 to 3,000 campaign participants. The second strategy was holding mass nonviolent civil disobedience and mass arrests to protest the plight of poverty in this country. And the third strategy was launching a nationwide boycott of national industries and shopping areas to prompt business leaders to pressure Congress to meeting the demands of the campaign. So these photos here on the slide are of the Mule Train, a caravan of about 15 covered wagons. And they were painted with slogans such as "Jesus was a poor man" and "Feed the poor," which the caravan came up from Marks, Mississippi. As a first step in building the power needed to achieve the goal of a radical redistribution of political and economic power, Dr. King, with other leaders such as Johnny Tillman of the National Welfare Rights Organization, helped work out the major elements of the platform of the Poor People's Campaign of 1968. Those simple tenets of the campaign were feed the hungry, hire the jobless, care for the sick, end slums, protect welfare rights, educate children, and, as I mentioned earlier, respect poor people. As its first public demonstration to launch the Poor People's Campaign on May 12th, 1968, Coretta Scott King called for reform of social service funding with these words, quote, Congress passes laws which subsidize corporation farms, oil companies, airlines, and houses for suburbia. But she pointed out it was unwilling to make similar investments to help the poor. And this disparity in the distribution of government funds became and remains a key theme of the Poor People's Campaign. Along with Mrs. King, Ethel Kennedy, the wife of Senator Robert Kennedy, led thousands through poor neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. for Mother's Day, the Mother's Day March. And that was organized by the National Welfare Rights Organization. She also added that I firmly believe our last and best hope for a future of brotherhood and peace lies in the effective use of woman power. Many groups came to Washington with the campaign in 1968 and spent that summer visiting various federal departments and Congress members, including the Native delegation that met with officials in the Department of the Interior. At that time, the unemployment rate on reservations was 10 times the national average, and as many as 60% of natives lived below the poverty line. Activist Melvin D. Tom, co-founder of the National Indian Youth Council of Berkeley, demanded that the Interior Department address natives' rights to sovereignty and equality, economic opportunity, and Indian-run schools. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, headed by Dr. King, was the architect of the Poor People's Campaign. They created an economic bill of rights that included demands for living wages, secure incomes, access to land and capital, and a significant role for those most affected by government programs in determining design and implementation of those programs. These demands echoed a number of similar points in the Economic Bill of Rights for the American people outlined by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in a radio address to the nation on January of 1944. The bill outlined by Roosevelt also included recognition of right to jobs, adequate incomes, and decent housing, as well as rights to medical care, education, and protections for older adults. But unfortunately, Roosevelt died 3 months later, and the bill was never implemented. Unfortunately, the unity and organization needed for the Poor People's Campaign of 1968 to complete its main strategies, to form that new and unsettling force, as Dr. King stated, and to disrupt complacent national life and achieve economic Bill of Rights was not easy to come by. The assassinations of Dr. King that April, and then the assassination of Senator Robert Kennedy in June, served to cripple the campaign and greatly limit its impact. Senator Kennedy had been a key proponent of the campaign, and out of respect, his funeral procession passed through Resurrection City. On June 19th, at the campaign's Solidarity Day rally for jobs, peace, and freedom, 50,000 people marched alongside the 3,000 participants that were living in Resurrection City. Then 5 days later, the Department of the Interior forced Resurrection City to close after the permit to use the parkland on the National Mall expired. You may recall earlier we mentioned Native leader Mel Tom, and he's in this photo here standing next to Ralph Abernathy in the center. So in the face of setbacks due to political violence and assassinations, as well as the difficulties of sustaining a national movement, the Poor People's Campaign of 1968 still had an impact, not only on government policies, but also on public perceptions. The campaign pushed Congress and federal agencies to allocate millions for programs such as Head Start and education and welfare services for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It also helped catalyze the desegregation of schools and extension of labor programs. The campaign introduced new strategies for protest and social change. It also helped transform national discussions on race, class, economic opportunities, security, and democracy. And as we all know, the year 1968 represented a transformative period in American history as the civil rights movement began addressing human rights issues across boundaries nationwide. So now we will shift into the current campaign. So I want to invite Nell back on to share her screen and take you through that.
Thank you so much, Mason. Let's see. I'm going to share this. Okay, so in 2017, which was 50 years from the time that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King initially called for the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Dr. Theo Harrison, Bishop William Barber, he was then Reverend Doctor, but now he's Bishop Barber, called for the revival of the Poor People's Campaign and called it the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And they led hundreds in a silent, nonviolent march on the Capitol in DC to present a letter to then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell condemning a recently passed budget bill. Senator McConnell refused to meet with them. But the campaign, as you know, wasn't stopped by that. So we are the modern campaign, and we recognize that we're standing on the shoulders who came before, and we are putting effort into learning the lessons and getting in step together. So on Mother's Day of 2018, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, launched with 40 days of action in 40 states across the country. And we are gonna now show you a video with Judy Woodruff, where she's interviewing Reverend Barber, that gives you a glimpse into the origins of the modern Poor People's Campaign.
Next, an effort to revive a famous movement of the 1960s focused on reducing poverty, inequality, and tackling social justice. But with such a broad agenda, will it find enough support at this polarized time? We start with a look at the campaign that began 50 years ago. Shortly before his death in 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. expanded his civil rights campaign to include calls for economic justice. He called for an economic revolution that included protection and services for the poorest Americans. He would call it the Poor People's Campaign.
We are coming to get our check.
The campaign would bring together poor people from across the country and from across racial, ethnic, and geographic lines, including poor whites, for a march on Washington.
Even if you have to bring a whole family, we are going to have in Washington facilities, and we're going to have food, and we are going to demand that the government do something about these conditions.
The first step was to construct a shanty town called Resurrection City on the National Mall, housing thousands of participants in a form of nonviolent civil disobedience. Dr. King himself would never make it to the March on Washington. He died that spring. But weeks after his assassination, 50,000 people gathered in solidarity, demanding economic reform on the steps where Dr. King had professed, "I have a dream."
We come with an appeal to open the doors of America to the almost 50 million Americans who have not been given a fair share of America's wealth and opportunity.
Half a century later, a group of religious and moral leaders are planning a wave of civil disobedience in Washington, a revival of the Poor People's Campaign. It is headed in part by the Reverend William Barber, who's the co-chair of the campaign. He led demonstrators at a rally in front of the U.S. Capitol this month, and he was arrested, alongside the Reverend Jesse Jackson, a key figure in the 1968 movement. I spoke with Reverend Barber recently when he was in Washington. Reverend William Barber, welcome to the NewsHour. Thank you very much for joining us. When the original Poor People's Campaign took place, it was 50 years ago. Dr. Martin Luther King was involved. After he was assassinated, it continued. But what is the connection between then and now?
Well, thank you so much for having us. And on behalf of the campaign, the National Poor People's Campaign, National Call for Moral Revival, and my co-chair, Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, let me say that the connection was, first of all, that it did continue, that people realized Dr. King was right. Racism, poverty, and militarism were interconnected. The connection today is we did a study, we commissioned a study with the Institute for Policy Studies and also had some help with Urban Institute, anecdotal and empirical data. And we did something called the Souls of Poor Folk, auditing America 50 years after the Poor People's Campaign. What did we find? Today, there are 140 million poor and low wealth people. Today, there are 250,000 people that die every year from low wealth. We have less voting rights today because of the gutting of the Voting Rights Act than we had in 1965. We have 62 million people who are working poor, who work for less than a living wage, and 14 million children who are in poverty.
Those numbers are overwhelming. They are daunting. You're not proposing to do away with poverty, are you?
We are saying that there are 5 interlocking injustices that America has to face because they continue to cause policy violence. That is systemic racism, particularly seen through the lens of voter suppression, where people use voter suppression to get elected, and then once they get elected, they pass policies that hurt the poor, mostly white women, children, and the working poor. Systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy and militarism, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism that says you don't have to address those issues. We are saying, yes, America is going to have to face these 5 interlocking injustices and change them.
Why can't you work through the existing political system, work to elect political figures who agree with your agenda?
Well, several reasons. Number one, we had 26 presidential debates in the last presidential election. On the Democrat and Republican side, not 1 hour was spent on poverty. Not 1 hour was spent on voter suppression and restoring the Voting Rights Act. Not 1 hour on the war economy and militarism. So if we're not even having the conversation, the first thing we have to change is the attention violence. We have an attention violence when it comes to poverty and the poor, and we must change that before you can change the agenda. And it must be a movement of the people from the bottom up.
Reverend Barber, I talk to people, I've read folks who agree with much of what you are saying you want, but they also are saying you're asking for too many different things, that you should narrow your list of ambitions, that you'll have a much better chance at getting something done.
Well, then those same people should say narrow the Constitution because it's pretty ambitious. It says domestic tranquility, establishment of justice, providing for the common defense, promoting the welfare, general welfare. Narrow the moral call of the Bible that says you're supposed to care for the stranger, the hungry, the sick, the left out, the lonely, the imprisoned. Why is it that that wealthy and greed gets to ask for everything? They want tax cuts, they get that. They want to block health care, they get that. But then we tell poor people, you have to ask for one thing. 37 million people without health care, we have to fight for health care. Millions of people without living wages, we can't just ask for one thing because they are systemically interlocking injustices.
If there are so many who you define as poor in this country, why aren't we seeing more people rise up and make this argument? I mean, it's right now it's left to you and a relatively small group of people who are making this argument, having the march, having your demonstrations and so forth.
Well, I don't know if I would say a relatively small group. We have organizing committees in 40 states. We have people who are organizing. In the last 2 weeks, we've had thousands of people attend, over nearly 2,000 people do civil disobedience, more than ever in the history of this country, simultaneously doing nonviolent moral fusion, civil disobedience. There is a rising, and why? And so what we're doing is we're launching a movement. We're not ending a movement. We're launching a movement and calling people to action. Many people do not know how bad it is, and many people who are poor and low wealth have been broken and pushed down and ignored. But where we're going from West Virginia to Wisconsin, from Alabama to Alaska, we're finding that there are thousands of people who are saying it's time for us to stand up and refuse to be silent.
You've said that the nation's problem is not that we don't have enough money. You said it's that we don't have the moral capacity to face what ails society. What did you mean by that?
That when you look at our deepest moral framework of the Constitution and our deepest moral values of our religious tradition, we too often have a political conversation that talks about left versus right, military or middle class. That's too puny. It's too narrow. 43.5% of this country is poor and low wealth. People are dying. Even Joseph Stiglitz, the economist, said that America has to face the cost of inequality. What I'm saying is we can't just have a left-right argument anymore. We need to have a deeply moral argument that says this is not just about Democrats or Republicans. This is about America. What kind of democracy do we want to be? You cannot have a democracy continue to exist when 400 people make an average of $97,000 an hour and you lock people up who simply want 15 in the union.
Does either political party come closer to your goals?
Well, I think they can. I think they hit at it. I think, of course, the extremists who have taken over the Republican Party have just gone so far extreme. You know, they're more focused on tax cuts to the wealthy. They want to blame poor people for their problems. Democrats, on the other hand, are willing to talk about, say, the Affordable Care Act and talk about the middle class. But the reality is neither party is willing to put right in front of America the issues of systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and say the word poverty. It's almost as though we've tried to remove even saying the word poverty, when in fact the majority of the poor people in this country are white, women, children, working people, and the disabled. So we have to change our narrative in this country. And the only way you can change the narrative is to change the narrator. That's why this campaign is focused on three things: breaking through the narrative, massive voter mobilization among the poor, and power building from the bottom up.
Reverend William Barber, the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign in 2018. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, and so the modern Poor People's Campaign has really emphasized being a movement and not a moment. And so, as you can see here, you know, these are some of the ways we define ourselves, that we're not an organization, because there are a million organizations. And what we have really focused on is creating an organism that organizations can join and participate in, to accomplish the goals of amplifying the voices of people who are mostly impacted by the interlocking injustices, and building power to make change, political change, policy change. So we are a fusion movement that recognizes the centrality of race. Our work is about building a broad, diverse coalition and intentionally diversifying the movement. We bring together people across geography, across age, across race, across gender, across issue, across different kinds of abilities. So we really are committed to everybody in, nobody out. We engage in indigenously led grassroots organizing. We are lifting from the bottom. We are a nonviolent movement. So that's a point of alignment that we insist that people who want to join the movement agree with. And we're resisting the one moment mentality. We really are building a movement. So we have 14 steps to moral fusion organizing, which we can share with you. And that will be found. We'll drop a link to that. It's on the Repairs of the Breach website. And so in this slide, you see the condensed version of the principles. We have these principles that guide the work that we do. And it starts with demanding justice for all and goes down the list, or, which really helps us get clear about when we make decisions about the kinds of actions that we take and who we support in terms of, the work that we do with community organizations and like that. Then we rely on these principles to guide us. And you'll notice that the last principle is that we embrace nonviolence, because we feel like it's particularly important for folks considering joining the campaign as a volunteer to understand that violent tactics or actions will not be tolerated. And especially when we're preparing to engage in nonviolent direct actions, we have a covenant of nonviolence that we ask people to sign. And the covenant of nonviolence it's more than just a document. It's an ideal that's woven through all of the principles of the campaign, because we recognize that there are sometimes people in our midst who are not intending really to join us in the work, but they're there to disrupt. And so we focus on, setting the tone and establishing the culture of nonviolence. We know that it's imperative to the strength and success of the Poor People's Campaign that we maintain nonviolent unity, discipline, and rigor, tapping into a power and soul force that exists within each of us. And so this is a look at one of the issues. The interlocking injustices include systemic poverty, racism, militarism, the military economy, ecological devastation, and the distorted moral narrative of Christian nationalism. But like these statistics really make clear the impact of all those five interlocking injustices on us as a people. Um, the US population is estimated at slightly over 300 million people. And in the audit, the Souls of Poor Folks, the Poor People's Campaign found that there are 140 million people who are poor or low income, which is more than 40% of the population living in or near poverty. And so the information here is on the poverty and low income status of First Nation people, LGBTQIA2S plus folks, disabled folks. And that information is, again, drives the work that we do, because we want the people who are public and elected officials to really understand that we're their constituents. 43% of the population, that means that in every state, there are people who are being represented, at least in theory, and that those representatives need to really understand what it means to be living in poverty in this country. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure of the Poor People's Campaign. You saw that we have two national co-chairs, Reverend Dr. Liz Seal Harris and Bishop William Barber. And there is a national coordinating committee that provides guidance to the campaign and to the co-chairs. And we are state-based is the structure of the national campaign, is that it's based in 45 states at this point. And so the California campaign is unusual in that because of the size of the state geographically and also numerically, we have several regions. And those regions are San Diego, San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, Inland Empire, Orange County, and Sacramento. And the most states have three co-chairs. And the structure of the campaign is that those three co-chairs include an impacted person, a faith leader, and then an organizer or an advocate from the community. But because again, but we're such a large state, California actually has four co-chairs. And so I have the honor of serving as one of the California co-chairs. Um, the the Poor People's Campaign is an all volunteer effort. And so none of us in the campaign are paid to play the roles that we play. We, we volunteer our time because it's important to us. Um, but there are two anchor organizations. Reverend Dr. Liz Thiel Harris is the leader at the Kairos Center, and Bishop Barber is the leader at the Repairs of the Breach. And so those two organizations provide staff that are the people who, if you've watched any of the Moral Monday broadcasts, and you know that there's a lot of support that's needed to do the organizing in the 45 states. And so that's where we get our national field team reps who help us figure out in our state campaigns how to get the work done. But the campaign itself does not have any paid staff. And so then we have these two goals. One is to amplify the voices of people who are directly impacted by the interlocking injustices. We want to change the narrative about poverty by changing the narrator. And so we are, committed to doing that. And because again, we don't want our public and elected officials to claim they don't really know what poor people are dealing with. And we have been spoken about and spoken to and spoken for a very long time. And so now we're raising our own voices and we won't be silent anymore. And then the other thing is to build power to change the policies that are impacting us. So the campaign has conducted a series of tours across the country. Actually, I got involved in 2019 during the Truth and Poverty Bus Tour when the campaign came across the country, stopping in some of the poorest communities. And I got invited to be a testifier at the Oakland stop. So the work of going into communities and really hearing from people to understand what the conditions are on the ground, where they are, so that we can support the work that they're doing is the model that we use. And so in 2016, there was a 30-state moral revival tour that traveled across the country, lifting up fights like the fight for 15 fast food workers. If you've been watching them on Mondays, we still are in the fight for 15 with the fast food workers. In 2018, we had the 40 days of moral action, and there were actions in 40 states across the country. People went to the state houses to make the demands at the state level. In 2019, there was a Truth and Poverty Bus Tour, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. And then later in 2019 and into 2020, there was the More Tour. We were gearing up for the elections that were coming. The Poor People's Campaign is nonpartisan, but we're deeply political. And so the More Tour was focused on mobilizing, organizing, registering, and educating people for a movement who vote. Because we really recognize that in 2016, the lack of people who were low income and poor, low propensity voters, the absence of their vote made a critical difference in the outcome of elections across the country. And so the More Tour was about changing that for the 2020 election. So the next slide, I'm going to ask Mason to share his screen again because it's a video from the repairs of the breach, which is about the tours.
What happens in Wall Street often doesn't say a thing about what's happening on the real streets of America.
Well, there are thousands who are not free. Yeah. And we know when one person is not free, none of us are free. Yeah. And we know that this isn't the case in God's economy. That's right. It doesn't have to be this way. That's right. That's right. We can do better.
Yeah. We can do better. Yeah. We can do better.
In America, we are taught that if you are poor, if you are homeless, if you are dispossessed, disenfranchised, it's because you've done something wrong. It's because you are inferior. It is because you are insufficient. And we believe that that is wrong. There are 140 million people in the United States who either live in poverty or are low income, who are one paycheck away from being homeless, or one wildfire away from being homeless, or one missed rent check or car payment away from being homeless. That's over a third of the United States. Now, to me, that is our deep shame as a country. That is a moral emergency, and that's why we need a Poor People's Campaign across the entire nation. We are identifying ourselves with this movement. And what that means is we're saying, hey, we're part of something bigger.
I understand some things about poverty because I am a poor person. We believe that when poor people name their own priorities because they know their own needs and know what needs to happen, that real change will be produced. If poor people are not allowed to speak these priorities for themselves, no one else will.
It's hard enough just to live on this earth and survive. And they shouldn't make it any more difficult. You shouldn't be homeless and be a criminal just because you're homeless. That's right. It's sad. Sad.
The homelessness that you're seeing in the streets of LA, in our community, you can see it all up and down the state. People encamped in the streets, living in their cars, in RVs, in garages. It's a growing phenomenon. And one thing that's important for me to point out, I don't think this is because people just don't know how to manage their finances. This is an economic devastation based on a systemic root.
We thought we were going off to be heroes. But what we found was that we are no more than pawns. And when we come home to live in an unjust and unequal society with the largest prison complex in the world and a political system that seeks to oppress voting rather than to expand it.
It's got to be done to help people with disabilities to vote. One of my concerns is when I went to vote, when the little sheet came out of the thing that showed what I voted for, I couldn't read it. It was in small print.
Let the people vote! That's how you honor veterans.
I get tired of hearing a certain false narrative. And it's that people like myself are weak, lazy, and immoral. But this is far from the truth because weak, lazy, and immoral is letting human beings live in the streets while billionaires receive trillion-dollar tax cuts.
Come on now. Come on now.
Denying health care to millions, cutting social services from the poor, and privatizing the VA while dropping bombs on brown people 1,000 miles away, diverting money from poor Americans to pay for those bombs and lying for the reasons why the bombs are even being dropped. Caging immigrant children.
Come on, Mike.
Ignoring ecological devastation in poor communities is weak, lazy, and immoral.
This was the site of the first of the 3 major fires that Lewiston experienced in 2013. They were all arson, and there was a lot of agreement that the fires themselves were tragic, but it surfaced this ongoing tension that we have in the community over, who we consider to be a part of our community. And many times it's not even coded. It's literally, we have too many immigrants, their homes burnt down, so let's not rebuild them because, we need less people like that here.
Look at everything the United States is doing. Look at all the wealth. That's all ours. I mean, that's all the Native American. It's easy to lose that focus because everybody came in that second chapter. But they got to go to the first chapter. The first chapter is going to tell the story of this country. And then Congress or nobody can turn away from it. So, this Poor People's Campaign needs to know that they have artillery, religious artillery that can help the movement. But if you don't recognize us, then it goes back to that second chapter, that we're the forgotten ones.
There are currently more than 11,000 unaccompanied children in the care of the U.S. and Humane Services. This policy is inhumane, it is immoral. To remain silent is to be complicit.
There is no individual solution to the social and economic problems that working women face.
We do not live in a mom-friendly or child-friendly country. We face inadequate paid maternity leave, abysmal postpartum health care, and equally appalling access to quality child care and public education. I feel expendable, and if I am expendable, so too are my children, and that I cannot stand for.
So we have to hold these politicians accountable. That's where our problem is. In St. John, people are not participating in these elections because these people who we elect, they are not representing us.
There's other systems here that are oppressing us that voting won't always fix, and that we've got to talk about, we've got to call it out, and we've got to mobilize and build a movement to be able to change these things that our politicians won't always change.
But I have to tell you, there's something going on in this nation right now. There's a beautiful birth of a movement, and it's going to take all of us. It's going to take all of us to stand up and say, I lived at a time when kids were going hungry and homeless, when they were closing hospitals and healthcare centers, when racists were emboldened. But I linked arms with people. I stood up and acted for justice, and we changed it. We changed it.
Forward together! One step back.
It's movement time. It's time to shake this nation because this nation is locked up. Our politics are small and binding, but we are those who can see the cracks in the walls and the way to come out of the cells. And we are determined to be free. And we're determined to see other folk free. Free with living wages. Right? Free. Free with health care. Free. Free with food on their tables, and free with good housing, and free with good water and land and air. And free with justice. That is the call of this movement. And we are the front line.
What do we want? Justice! What do we want?
One of the core features of the campaign, as Reverend Barber likes to say, we don't want to be loud and wrong. So we have some documents that we feature on this slide. And so I mentioned the Souls of Poor Folk, which is the audit that asks the question, what has happened in the last 50 years since the initial Poor People's Campaign? And that was where we found that 140 million people were living at or near the poverty line in this country. We then released a moral agenda, a moral budget. There's the moral agenda and Declaration of Fundamental Rights came in between these two. And then the moral budget basically said, now that we know that what the problem is, here's where you can find the money to fix it, because part of the distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism is that there's not enough, but we know there is enough. So after, in 2018, we had the moral budget that was released, and actually we delivered it to the Budget Committee at Congress in case they needed some suggestions about where the money might come from. And then in July of 2020, we released the Jubilee Policy Platform. And I would encourage people to take a look at that platform because it lays out, now that we know where the money is going to come from, what are the policies that we need in place to address the interlocking injustices. And then in August 2020, we released the study that looked at the impact of poor and low income voters on the outcome of elections as a way of, really getting clear about what it would mean if people felt like their issues were represented by the people who are in power and, and making the policies. So we have those documents and they're all available on the National Campaign website, and encourage you to investigate those. So I'm going to skip that video because we are running out of time. And so the next section is about some of the ways that we have been active in the state campaign in California. So this slide that you're looking at now was created. It's a virtual art build. And so in the time of COVID, we've gotten creative, as you all know, about how we do things. And so this involved people from all over the state making each one letter in the slogan, "Everybody's got a right to live." And then thank you, Reverend Rowan, for photoshopping all those images together. And so that's, we again have art and culture and theomusicology as a central tool that we use in the organizing. And then in the run up to the vote, we distributed over 20,000 door hangers throughout the state. And so these are some pictures from some of the regions, which included the NAACP in Vacaville distributed 1,000 door hangers there. And then San Jose had a crew of people who delivered door hangers, and Sacramento. These pictures are from Sacramento and San Jose and Vacaville. And then in December, because we are committed to challenging the distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism, when Sean Foyk organized an action in Los Angeles on Skid Row. Sean Foyk is a faith organizer who prides himself on conducting services unmasked and non-socially distanced. And so we organized throughout the state to really challenge that, because people living on Skid Row are already at risk, high risk for COVID. And we felt like, for him to have an event there was just unconscionable. And so we did a few different things to organize around that. And then recently we had the demands delivery to the state capitals all across the country, including in Sacramento. And if some of you on the call, no doubt, have been participating in the Moral Mondays. And so that's another way that another action that we took recently. And these pictures are from Sacramento, where they organized a die-in to protest the Services Not Sweeps Coalition. Were protesting, the neglect of people who were living on the street, even as the weather got harder and harder to be outside in. And so that was in the Sacramento region. And then LA, there was this action, car caravan and action outside. That may be LA City Hall, I'm not sure. And Kenya Alcocer, who is a former co-chair of the campaign, was quoted as saying, "We were already fighting for an eviction moratorium before the COVID crisis, and now we're seeing that was possible during this crisis. If the banks are getting bailed out and corporations are getting bailed out, why aren't poor people getting bailed out through this process as well?" So that was in LA. And then the Bay Area folks did a street mural. So this was right before the election, and David Solnit, East Point Peace Academy, Climate, we did this this mural that involved the big mural that was on the side of the federal building in Oakland that says "Choose Democracy to Stop a Coup." And then there were 10 community groups that created small circular murals all around that message. So that was another thing that, another way that we are using art, culture, and theomusicology. And so at this point, I'm going to invite, let's see if, I know that Mason mentioned that he had to leave, and so I think we may have lost him. And I want to appreciate him for all he did to make this happen. So this next session is to talk about, ways that you can get involved right now. So there are, these links will be in the chat for you. We have a petition that we are circulating, calling for a moral response to COVID-19. We have the 14 policy priorities to heal the nation that we have presented to the Biden-Harris administration for their first 100 days in office so that they can have a clear moral agenda going forward. If you know people who've been impacted who've died from COVID-19 and poverty, there's a memorial wall that you can add pictures and stories to. And then the Moral Mondays that are happening for the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration, which are mostly virtual, although, as I mentioned, we have had some in-person actions, but when we do in-person actions, we have COVID protocols that we follow in terms of insisting that people wear masks and be socially distanced, and we have hand sanitizer and like that, because we are doing, what we can to protect people, and so that we can still amplify our voices, but in a way that's safe and low risk. And yeah, and so you can contact us through the national website, which is here. And also there's lots of information there. There are fact sheets for all 50 states. There are all the documents we've mentioned and then some more. You can connect to the live stream there and like that. And then we're on Twitter, national, California, and the Bay Area are listed there. And also you can check us out on Facebook. So we invite you to contact us and let us know, how you want to be involved. So we are always appreciative for whatever donations people can make. And so there are a couple of ways that you can support us with financial contributions, including we have a GoFundMe, California GoFundMe account. And then you can also make out checks to our fiscal sponsor, ATINA, which stands for Environmentalism Through Inspiration and Nonviolent Action. And they have agreed to be our fiscal sponsor. Since we're not a nonprofit, we have to have a fiscal sponsor so that we can receive funds that are tax deductible. And so we want to thank you for joining us, and we're going to share a feedback form that includes space to say how you might want to be involved. And I'm going to stop there, and we have a little bit of time left to do some breakout groups, and so that you get a chance to meet people who are from your region and just reflect on what you've heard here. So we'll spend about the next 15 minutes doing that before we come back for closure. So thank you so much again for joining us. So let's see. As we get ready to go into the breakouts, what we want to ask you to do is, once you're in the breakout, somebody volunteer to facilitate. Because it's always helpful if somebody can just remind people that, everybody should have a turn to speak. And so we want to ask somebody to take it upon themselves to volunteer to do that, and ask you to introduce yourself with your name, your pronouns, your location, and whatever reflections you might have on the presentation. What was new to you, what was surprising, what did you want to know more about, and or what are your next steps in terms of your involvement in the campaign. And with that, I'm going to ask Reverend Rowan if we're ready for breakouts. So at this point, we wanted to take a few comments and just see what what your reflections are. If you have questions, this would be a good time to ask any questions like that.
How do we volunteer? What can we volunteer?
Great question. So we have a feedback form that we're going to drop in the chat for you to fill out. And where are you?
San Jose. I'm with Rowan. I know Rowan.
Perfect. Okay, perfect. Well, Reverend Rowan is very active in that region. And so, she would be a good person to check in with. I know that, yeah, and so San Jose is part of the Greater Bay Area region. And so you're welcome to join any of the working groups that we have here in the Bay Area. They include Faith Leader Outreach Working Group. There's a speaker training working group that has developed this welcome session. There is a legal working group that is, you don't have to be a lawyer to participate, but it takes up the question of, how do we address the interlocking injustices from the legal angle, and also provides support for us when we are doing direct actions. There is also an art, culture, and theomusicology working group where you got to see some of the work that we've done in terms of organizing art bills, virtual and also in person. And there is an access working group. One of the principles that we honor is everybody in, nobody out. And so we have a working group that is devoted to asking the question, what are the barriers to people participating? People whose first language is not necessarily English, people who have disabilities, people who are living with disabilities. And so we have an access working group focused on that. And then we have an outreach and inclusion working group that does the outreach to bring individuals and organizations that are in alignment with our principles and demands to the campaign. So that on the feedback form, there's a list of the working groups that are, that you are welcome to join. And then some of those working groups are also statewide working groups. The legal working group is a statewide working group. There's a faith working group that's statewide. And so that just means that, everybody, those working groups include people from all over the state. And I forgot the policy and political education working group that organizes things like a reading of the Jubilee policy platform. And they're having a reading of the Jubilee policy platform this Thursday, the 8th at 12 o'clock for anybody who's interested in joining that. And they meet regularly on Thursdays, every Thursday at 12 o'clock.
I don't know how to get the things on the chat. So can I go to the website and find things?
Well, let's see. Are you able to see the chat?
Well, I don't know really how to get to, I guess you go to, let me see if I can do it. You probably go to chat. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there it is. Oh, okay.
Okay. And if you click on what's in the chat, it should open.
Okay. So yeah.
And I see a question in the chat from Paul about joining that meeting. Are you asking about the policy and political education, the Jubilee study group?
Yeah, on Thursday. You might have said, and I missed it somehow. But yeah.
No, I didn't. I just said that it was happening, but I actually didn't say. But I actually didn't say how to join it. So,
okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So, Paul, if you click on that form and indicate that you want the link to the study group, I'll make sure that you get it.
Which one?
The
Google Docs?
The feedback form, yes.
Okay. Yep, I will do that.
Okay, perfect. Because it'll ask, for your email and all of that, and you can just say you want to attend the reading group.
And now the study group is a good word here, because I would encourage people, it might take you a while to find exactly how you want to be involved and what there is to do. And as we said, this is an organism, not an organization. So it's not like we have, okay, you know, do this tomorrow, do that the next day kind of thing. So educating yourself, getting to know, going to the Moral Mondays, those are all on Zoom now, that kind of thing, Jubilee Policy Platform, reading Reverend Barber's books, any of those things, just let yourself get immersed in some of this, because there's a lot. It's a very rich material. There's a lot to understand, and you'll each find your place, I'm sure. And we welcome you.
Yes, absolutely. And we're also happy to chat you up. So, you know, if you want to have a conversation about how you might get involved, I'd be happy to do that.
Education.
Say that on the forum as well, you know, because that's part of our work is around helping people find ways to connect to the campaign that makes sense for you. So we're happy to do that. That's part of what the Outreach and Inclusion Working Group does, and I'm part of that group.
What group do you want to sign up for? I didn't know what group, so I didn't do that. Yeah, I don't know. We don't need to do this really.
Someone's not muted and needs to be.
Okay, so let's see. Okay, and so we are just at just about time. And so these welcome sessions happen monthly, the first Tuesday of every month. And so you're always welcome to come back, and you're also always welcome to share the information, the invite with other people. You know, if you're in a congregation or a community organization or a neighborhood group or wherever you think people would benefit from being involved in the Poor People's Campaign, you certainly are welcome to share the invite to the welcome session. And so with that, I want to thank you all for joining us today. And again, thank our tech support, Reverend Rowan Fairgrove and Mary Claire Newman. You've been fabulous. Thank you so much. And thanks Mason also, who had to leave for an appointment. And one of the traditions in the Poor People's Campaign is that we have a chant that is a call and response chant. And so the way it goes is that when I say forward together, you say not one step back. Okay, are you ready? Forward together.
Not
one step back.
Forward together.
Not one step back.
Forward together.
Not one step back.
Thank you all so much for being here, and take good care. We hope to see you, hear from you about how you want to be involved, and then see you virtually and eventually in person. Yeah. All righty. Take care. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Nell.
Thank you.